The man who controlled the city was starving to death. Not from poverty, from power. Every meal served in his penthouse felt like a threat. Every bite tasted like ash and paranoia. High-end chefs were fired weekly. Doctors whispered about feeding tubes. Then a night shift maid, too exhausted to care about his reputation, made a bowl of cheap, leftover stew for herself. One smell broke through his defenses. One bite changed the hierarchy of an entire empire. Leo Costa was disappearing inside his own suits. He noticed it first in the mirror, the way the broad, structured shoulders of his bespoke Tom Ford jackets seemed to hover over his frame rather than rest on it. Then his tailor noticed. The old Italian man had said nothing, just quietly gathered an extra 2 inches of fabric at the waist with his chalk, his mouth drawn into a grim, worried line. Now everyone was starting to notice. Leo sat at the head of a long mahogany table in the back room of a dockside warehouse, listening to his underboss, Carmine, dispute shipping tariffs with the union reps. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the low, aggressive hum of men who solved problems with violence. Leo didn't care about the tariffs. He cared about the ringing in his ears. A low, persistent hum of fatigue vibrated behind his eyes. He pressed his thumb against the heavy gold watch sliding down his thinning wrist. It was supposed to fit snug. He adjusted it, grinding his back teeth together to keep his expression strictly neutral. In his world, weakness was an invitation for a coup, and starvation was the ultimate weakness. Leo. Carmine's voice cut through the fog. "You backing me on this?" Leo blinked. The faces around the table were expectant. Some looked respectful. A few, too few for his liking, looked analytical, searching the hollows of his cheeks for a crack in the armor. "We don't negotiate margins we already own," Leo said. His voice was a low gravel, steady and cold. It took a monumental effort to push the words up from his chest. "Tell them they take the previous rate or we find a new union." The meeting concluded shortly after. The men filed out, leaving only Carmine. Carmine poured himself a finger of scotch, his eyes lingering on Leo. "You didn't eat the spread," Carmine noted, gesturing to the catered tray of cured meats, imported cheeses, and crusty bread sitting untouched in the center of the table. "I wasn't hungry." "You haven't been hungry in 3 months, boss. You look like a ghost." "Worry about the docks, Carmine. I'll worry about my diet." It was a lie. Leo was starving. The hunger was a physical, gnawing animal in his gut, but it was caged by an insurmountable psychological wall. It started after the hit in Palermo last year, the one that took out his uncle through a slow-acting thallium poisoning slipped into a bottle of vintage Barolo. Leo had inherited the empire, and with it, a paranoia so complete it had rewired his nervous system. Food was no longer sustenance, it was a vector. Every plate put in front of him triggered a cold sweat. His throat would physically close. The smell of rich, complex sauces made his stomach violently contract. He had hired a rotating door of Michelin-starred private chefs, demanding rigorous background checks and food tasters. It didn't matter. The moment he tried to swallow, his body rejected it. He survived on black coffee, water, and forcing down dry crackers in the dead of night. His body was eating its own muscle to keep his brain functioning. Later that evening, back in the sprawling, sterile expanse of his downtown penthouse, Leo sat at a dining table built for 12. He sat alone at the head. The current chef, a nervous Frenchman named Laurent, brought out a silver cloche. He lifted it with a flourish. Beneath it sat a delicate piece of pan-seared sea bars, resting on a bed of microgreens and a saffron emulsion. It was mathematically perfect. It looked like a museum exhibit. Leo stared at the fish. The smell of the saffron hit his nose. His jaw locked. "I sourced the base this morning, Mr. Costa," Laurent offered, his voice trembling slightly. He knew the turnover rate in this kitchen. Leo picked up the heavy silver fork. He cut a small, flaky white piece. He brought it to his mouth. He told his brain to open his jaw, to chew, to swallow. "Just eat it," he demanded of himself. "You are dying." He put it in his mouth. The texture of the emulsion coated his tongue. Instantly, his throat clamped shut. A wave of intense nausea hit him, accompanied by a spike of adrenaline. His brain screamed at him that it was poison, that he was making a mistake, that the rich sauce was hiding a chemical burn. Leo spat the fish into his linen napkin. He dropped the fork. It clattered against the fine china, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Laurent flinched. "Clear it," Leo rasped, pushing the plate away. He wiped a bead of cold sweat from his temple. "Sir, if the flavor profile is too—" "Clear the plate, Laurent, and pack your knives. The severance will be wired to your account by morning." Leo stood up. The room spun for a sickening second. He braced his hand on the back of the heavy leather chair, waiting for his vision to clear. Another failure. Another night of lying awake, his stomach cramping, his mind racing, wondering how many days he had left before he collapsed in front of his men. He retreated to his study, locking the heavy oak doors behind him. He poured a glass of water, sitting in the dark, watching the city lights bleed through the rain-streaked windows. He was 34 years old. He controlled millions of dollars, hundreds of men, and the political machinery of the city. And he was going to die because he couldn't swallow a piece of fish. Nora Hayes did not care about the Mafia. She cared about her feet. They throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that radiated up her calves and settled deep in her lower back. She was 27, and she carried her weight with a solid, grounded pragmatism. She wasn't delicate. Her body was built for endurance, taking up space in a world that usually demanded women shrink. Her thick thighs chafed under the cheap polyester of her maid's uniform, and her broad shoulders ached from scrubbing the grout in the master bathrooms of the elite. It was 2 a.m. The penthouse was dead quiet. Nora was hired through an agency that specifically vetted staff for discreet, high-net-worth individuals. She knew her employer was Leo Costa. She knew what that name meant in the city. But to Nora, a crime boss was just another rich guy who didn't know how to clean his own baseboards. As long as the direct deposit cleared every Friday, paying for her younger sister's insulin and the rent on their cramped 2-bedroom apartment, Costa could run an international smuggling ring from the living room for all she cared. She stood in the massive industrial-grade kitchen. The counters were gleaming stainless steel. The fridge was a walk-in. The fired chef, Laurent, had left in a flurry of French curses 3 hours ago, leaving the kitchen spotless but barren of anything prepared. Nora's stomach gave a loud, hollow growl. She hadn't eaten since a stale bagel at 11 a.m. The agency rules were strict. Do not touch the client's food. But Nora was past the point of professional courtesy. The client didn't eat anyway. Everyone on the staff knew it. The man was a walking corpse. She opened the massive double doors of the refrigerator. Inside were rows of exotic, expensive ingredients. Truffles, Wagyu beef, imported caviar. Things that required tweezers to plate. Nora wrinkled her nose. She didn't want foam or emulsions. She wanted food. She dug around the bottom crisper drawers and found a sack of russet potatoes, slightly soft but salvageable. In the back of the meat locker, ignored by the fancy chefs, was a cheap, tough cut of chuck roast meant for making stock. There was a bruised yellow onion, some wilting carrots, and half a bulb of garlic. Perfect. Nora moved with a heavy, practiced rhythm. She wasn't a chef. She was a woman who had been feeding her family since she was 12. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven from the hanging rack. She cranked the industrial gas burner to high, letting a massive slab of salted butter melt and foam in the pan. She chopped the chuck roast into rough, uneven chunks, tossing them in flour, salt, and heavily cracked black pepper. She dropped them into the hot butter. The sear was loud, a violent hiss that filled the sterile kitchen with the sharp, overwhelming scent of browning meat and melting fat. Nora didn't use measuring cups. She tossed in the chopped onions and carrots, letting them sweat and caramelize in the beef fat. She smashed 3 cloves of garlic with the heel of her hand and threw them in, skins and all. She deglazed the pan with a splash of cheap red cooking wine she found under the counter, scraping up the dark, burnt bits from the bottom. She dumped in the chopped potatoes, covered it all in beef broth, slammed the heavy lid on top, and lowered the heat. 45 minutes later, the kitchen smelled entirely different. It didn't smell like a Michelin star restaurant. It smelled like a grandmother's house in the dead of winter. It smelled thick, heavy, and undeniably safe. Nora leaned against the counter, eating straight out of the Dutch oven with a wooden spoon. She blew on a scalding piece of potato, groaning in relief as the hot, salty starch hit her empty stomach. She didn't bother plating it. She was too tired. She just stood there, eyes half closed, savoring the rich, dark gravy that coated the back of the spoon. She didn't hear him come in. "What is that?" Nora choked. She spun around, clutching the wooden spoon like a weapon. Leo Costa stood in the doorway. He looked worse than he did in the tabloids. He wore dark slacks and a white undershirt that hung loosely on his frame. His dark hair was messy, and the bags under his eyes were the color of bruised plums. He looked feral, exhausted, and hollowed out. Nora swallowed hard, her heart kicking against her ribs. She was caught stealing. "I was just cleaning the cast iron, sir. I had to boil some water." It was a terrible lie. Her mouth was literally shining with beef fat. Leo didn't look at her face. His sunken, dark eyes were locked onto the steaming cast-iron pot. He took a step into the kitchen. He moved silently, like a ghost haunting his own house. He didn't speak. He just walked closer, the scent of the heavy peasant food hitting him in waves. His brain, which had spent 3 months screaming poison at the sight of every delicate, overhandled dish, suddenly short-circuited. There was no artifice here, no microgreens hiding a bitter chemical taste, no complex sauces masking thallium. It was beef, fat, and salt. It smelled like the kitchens in the neighborhood he grew up in, back before his father made his first million, back when life was dangerous on the streets, but safe in the house. Nora backed up, her hip pressing against the counter. She watched his chest rise and fall. She noticed the slight tremor in his hands. "Sir," she asked, her voice cautious. She expected him to fire her. She expected him to yell. Leo stopped 3 feet away. He looked at the wooden spoon in her hand. "Give me that," he rasped. Nora blinked. The spoon?" "The spoon." She hesitated, then slowly extended her hand, offering him the wooden utensil. Leo took it. His fingers brushed hers. His skin was ice cold. He didn't grab a bowl. He didn't ask for a napkin. He simply dipped the wooden spoon into the pot, scooping up a piece of beef and a thick wedge of potato dripping in dark brown gravy. He stared at it for a long moment. Nora held her breath. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. Leo put the spoon in his mouth. He closed his eyes. The physical reaction was immediate. His throat didn't close. His stomach didn't violently contract. The heavy, unpretentious salt and fat coated his tongue, grounding him instantly. It was hot, a little burnt on the edges, and tasted entirely of survival. His jaw worked. He chewed. And then, for the first time in 90 days, Leo swallowed without gagging. He opened his eyes. They were wide, a strange, frantic energy sparking in the dark irises. He dipped the spoon back in. He ate another bite, then another. He ate fast, practically inhaling the scalding food, ignoring the heat burning the roof of his mouth. He ate like a starving animal that had finally cornered its prey. Nora stood frozen, watching the most feared man in the city eat cheap beef stew straight out of a pot with a used wooden spoon. She watched the colour slowly, incrementally, start to return to his ashen face. He ate half the pot before his stomach finally gave a sharp cramp, protesting the sudden influx of heavy food. He dropped the spoon back into the pot. He gripped the edge of the counter, breathing heavily, bracing himself for the inevitable nausea. Seconds ticked by. A minute. The food stayed down. Leo slowly stood straight. He looked at Nora. Really looked at her. He took in her messy bun, the bleach stains on her cheap blue uniform, the thick curves of her hips, and the exhausted, defensive tilt of her chin. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rougher than before. "Nora," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Nora Hayes." Leo nodded once. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, a crude gesture that starkly contrasted with his billion-dollar surroundings. "Leave the pot on the stove, Nora," he said quietly. He turned and walked out of the kitchen. The following morning, the penthouse was in chaos. Carmine had arrived at 8 a.m. for their daily briefing, only to find the kitchen staff packing up their stations. The prep cooks, the sous chef, the sommelier. Everyone was being systematically handed severance checks by Leo's head of security. "What the hell is going on?" Carmine demanded, storming into Leo's home office. Leo was sitting behind his massive oak desk. For the first time in months, he wasn't leaning his head against his hands in exhaustion. He was reviewing a ledger. There was a faint flush of color in his cheeks, and the tremor in his fingers was gone. "I'm restructuring the household staff," Leo said without looking up. "You fired the entire kitchen?" "Leo, you need to eat. The doctors said—" "I ate last night," Leo interrupted, finally looking up. His gaze was sharp. The fog of starvation lifted just enough to reveal the ruthless intelligence underneath. "And I didn't throw it up." Carmine stopped. He looked at Leo closely. "You kept something down. What did Laurent make?" "Laurent is gone. He makes art, not food. Tell security to bring the night maid up here." 10 minutes later, Nora was standing on the plush Persian rug in Leo's office. She had been midway through scrubbing a guest bathtub when security tapped her on the shoulder. She still wore her yellow rubber gloves, clutching a bottle of ammonia to her chest like a shield. She looked around the dark, intimidating room, her eyes darting from the leather-bound books to the imposing figure of Carmine, and finally to Leo. "I'm fired," she thought. He realized I used his expensive butter to make peasant food, and now I'm fired. She mentally calculated how much she had in savings. It wouldn't cover the rent. "Take the gloves off, Nora," Leo said. Nora stripped the yellow rubber off her hands, stuffing them into her apron pocket. She set the ammonia on a side table, refusing to shrink under the stares of the two men. She squared her shoulders, her broad frame pulling the fabric of her uniform tight. "If this is about the groceries," Nora started, her tone defensive and flat. "Take it out of my last paycheck. I was hungry. I didn't touch the expensive stuff." Carmine frowned, looking between Leo and the maid. "What groceries?" "You're not fired," Leo said, He leaned back in his leather chair. "You're promoted," Nora blinked. "Promoted to what? Head toilet scrubber?" Carmine stiffened at her tone. "Watch your mouth." Nora barely glanced at him. She was too tired to be intimidated by men in suits. She dealt with angry landlords and predatory loan officers. Mobsters were just a different flavor of the same headache. She looked back at Leo. "You're going to cook for me," Leo stated. It wasn't a request. Nora let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "I'm not a chef. I don't know how to make foam or reductions or whatever it is you rich people eat to pretend you're not hungry. I don't want foam. I want what you made last night. I want food that tastes like food." Leo leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I will triple your current salary from the agency. You work directly for me now. Full benefits. You cook my breakfast, my lunch, and my dinner. You don't use recipes. You don't plate it with tweezers. You cook it the way you cook for yourself." Nora stared at him. Triple her salary. That was enough to move her sister to a ground-floor apartment. That was enough to pay off the medical debt in 6 months. "I use a lot of butter," Nora said deadpan. "Use all of it," Leo replied without missing a beat. "I'm not serving you in a tuxedo. I'm not a butler." "Wear whatever you want." Nora narrowed her eyes, searching his face for the catch. But all she saw was a desperate man hiding behind a mask of authority. He needed her. It was a strange, unsettling realization. The king of the city was at her mercy because she knew how to brown a piece of meat. "Fine," Nora said, picking up her bottle of ammonia. "But I'm off at 8 p.m. If you want a midnight snack, you microwave it yourself." Carmine looked like he was about to draw a weapon, deeply offended by her insolence. But Leo just stared at her, the corner of his mouth twitching upward for a fraction of a second. "Understood," Leo said. "Start with lunch." Her first official meal was a test of wills. At 1 p.m., Leo sat down at the massive dining table. Carmine and 2 bodyguards stood by the walls, watching in silence. Nora pushed through the swinging kitchen doors. She wasn't wearing a chef's white coat. She was wearing a faded black t-shirt and jeans, a large apron tied around her waist. She walked with heavy, purposeful steps, carrying a large ceramic plate. She set it down in front of Leo with a dull thud. Carmine leaned in, expecting poison. He expected culinary sabotage. It was a thick, bone-in pork chop, smothered in a dark onion gravy, sitting next to a mountain of lumpy, skin-on mashed potatoes. There was a side of green beans, heavily blistered in bacon fat. It looked aggressively unrefined. Nora didn't say a word. She crossed her arms over her chest, stepping back. Leo stared at the plate. The smell of the caramelized onions and roasted pork hit his senses. The paranoia flared for a brief second, the old voice whispering about toxins. But the sheer, unapologetic simplicity of the food shut the voice down. A Michelin chef would hide poison in a delicate sauce. A tired, cynical maid who just wanted to go home did not have the energy for assassination. Leo picked up his knife and fork. He cut a thick piece of the pork, dragging it through the mashed potatoes. He took a bite. The silence in the dining room was deafening. The bodyguards watched their boss, waiting for the gag reflex, waiting for the plate to be thrown. Leo chewed. He swallowed. He didn't choke. He didn't sweat. He took another bite, moving methodically, eating with a steady, quiet desperation. He ate the entire plate, stripping the pork bone clean. When he was done, he set the cutlery down. He looked up at Nora. "Too much salt," Leo lied. Nora rolled her eyes, picking up the empty plate. "Drink some water, boss. Dinner is at 6. She walked back into the kitchen. Carmine stared after her in shock, then looked back at Leo. Leo poured himself a glass of water, his chest rising and falling evenly. The hollow feeling in his stomach was gone, replaced by a heavy, warm anchor. He wasn't cured. The Empire was still threatening to crush him. But as he wiped his mouth with a napkin, he realized something profound. He was going to survive, and the woman who was going to save his life didn't give a damn about his power. She just wanted to get paid. 6 weeks passed. The transformation was brutally physical. The tailor was summoned back to the penthouse. This time, the chalk marks moved outward. The hollows beneath Leo Costa's cheekbones filled in, replaced by the sharp, formidable jawline of a man who no longer looked like a walking corpse. The deep purple shadows under his eyes faded to a manageable grey. His chest broadened, filling out the Tom Ford suits, the fabric pulling taut across his shoulders. The animal inside him was no longer starving. It was awake, and it was dangerous. The men in his organization noticed. The hesitation at the mahogany tables vanished. Rivals who had smelled blood in the water and started encroaching on his supply lines suddenly pulled back. Leo didn't just look healthy. He radiated a terrifying, grounded energy. He was decisive. He was ruthless. He stopped delegating the ugly jobs to Carmine and started showing up at the docks himself. His presence alone enough to force the union bosses to swallow their grievances. He survived on a diet of pure, unadulterated working-class grit. Nora ruled the kitchen like a tyrant in a flour-dusted apron. She had thrown out the truffle oil on day 2. She binned the saffron, the caviar, and the edible gold leaf. In their place, she stocked the walk-in fridge with whole chickens, slabs of bacon, sharp cheddar cheese, blocks the size of bricks, and sacks of yellow onions. She bought a cheap plastic boombox, setting it on the stainless steel prep table. She listened to classic rock and 90s R&B, the volume dialed up to drown out the heavy silence of the penthouse. The dynamics of the household shifted entirely. Carmine and the bodyguards, seasoned killers who didn't blink at a gunshot, learned to tiptoe around the kitchen. It happened on a Tuesday. Carmine had walked in, demanding a cup of coffee while Nora was perfectly timing a batch of fried chicken. He had grabbed a mug, stepped directly into her workspace, and bumped her hip. Nora hadn't screamed. She hadn't flinched. She simply turned, holding a massive set of steel tongs dripping with scalding peanut oil, and leveled a dead-eyed stare at the underboss. "Step out of my triangle," she had said, her voice flat. Carmine stared at her, bristling. "I'm getting coffee." "You're in the way. The coffee machine is on the outer counter. The fryer is mine. You have 3 seconds before I drop a breast piece in this oil and let it splash." Carmine looked ready to pull his sidearm. Leo, who had been sitting at the dining table reading a dossier, didn't even look up. "Move, Carmine," Leo called out, his voice echoing in the large room. "If you ruin the breading, I'll put a bullet in your knee." Carmine retreated. Nora went back to her chicken. She didn't thank Leo. She didn't act grateful. She just plated the chicken, dumped a massive scoop of potato salad next to it, and slid it onto the dining table. It was a strange, unspoken rhythm. Leo spent his days swimming in a world of deceit, extortion, and violence. Every smile he received was a lie. Every handshake was a calculated risk. But at 1 p.m. and 6 p.m., he returned to the penthouse. He walked into the kitchen, the smell of roasted garlic, seared meat, or baked sugar hitting his lungs like oxygen. He didn't trust anyone in his empire, but he trusted the woman who wore faded jeans and cursed at the oven. The psychological block remained strictly defined. If he attended a sit-down at a restaurant, he drank bottled water that he opened himself. He still couldn't eat food prepared by anyone else. The paranoia lived right beneath his skin. But when Nora slammed a plate of heavy, greasy, unapologetic food down in front of him, the tension in his spine evaporated. He watched her sometimes, from the doorway of the kitchen, leaning against the doorframe, quiet as a shadow. He noticed things. He noticed she wasn't built like the women who usually occupied his world. The models and actresses who draped themselves over his arm at galas were all sharp angles and calculated diets. They were brittle. Nora was solid. She had a thick waist, heavy breasts that strained against the cotton of her t-shirts, and wide, powerful hips. When she moved, there was a weight to her, a deeply ingrained competence. She didn't glide, she marched. Her hair was always tied up in a messy, practical bun, pieces escaping to stick to the sweat on her forehead. She never wore makeup. She smelled like butter, bleach, and vanilla. She was the most grounded thing in his life. She never asked about his day. She didn't care about the territory disputes in the South End. She only cared if he finished his vegetables. "You didn't eat the broccoli," she noted one evening, crossing her arms as she stared down at his plate. It was a Tuesday, meatloaf night. Leo wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. It was overcooked. "It was steamed for exactly 4 minutes. Eat it, or you don't get the cobbler I made for dessert." Leo Costa, a man who had authorized 3 hits that week, looked at the pile of green vegetables. He picked up his fork. He ate the broccoli. Nora nodded, satisfied. She turned to fetch the dessert. Leo watched the sway of her hips as she walked away, a heavy, unfamiliar heat pooling low in his stomach. He didn't just rely on her to survive anymore. He was starting to crave her presence. The illusion of their domestic bubble shattered on a Thursday night. A heavy, torrential downpour hammered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Nora was supposed to leave at 8 p.m., but the storm had flooded the subway lines, and surge pricing on cabs was absurd. "I'm staying," she announced, walking into Leo's office. She threw a damp dish towel over her shoulder. "I'm not paying $90 to sit in traffic. I'll sleep in the guest quarters and make you eggs in the morning." Leo barely looked up from his laptop. "Fine. Lock the kitchen doors. I have a meeting at midnight." "Don't track mud on the hardwood," she warned before leaving. The meeting was not a negotiation. It was an execution. A capo named Russo had been skimming from the construction unions. Worse, he had been leaking shipping routes to a rival crew. Leo had known for weeks, letting the rat feed false information while he gathered the evidence. Tonight, the trap snapped shut. At midnight, the private elevator pinged. 4 men walked in. Russo, arrogant and oblivious, and 3 of Leo's enforcers. Nora was in the kitchen. She was baking bread. It was a nervous habit. The physical act of kneading heavy dough grounded her when the city felt too loud. She had her headphones in, listening to a true crime podcast, her knuckles white as she pushed and folded the sticky mass of flour and water on the steel counter. She didn't hear the shouting in the living room. She didn't hear the sickening thud of bone breaking or the desperate, wet gurgle that followed. She only noticed something was wrong when the heavy kitchen doors swung open, hitting the rubber stops with a violent crack. Nora pulled an earbud out, turning around. Leo stood in the doorway. The tailored perfection of his suit was ruined. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. His tie was gone, and his hands were coated in blood. It was smeared across his knuckles, dark and glistening in the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen. A few drops splattered onto the pristine white tiles. His eyes were entirely black, the pupils blown wide with adrenaline and violence. He was breathing heavily, a predatory, terrifying figure. The mask of the civilized businessman was gone. The monster was standing in her kitchen. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. Nora stood frozen. Her hands were coated in white flour, held suspended over the dough. She looked at his bloody hands. She looked at his face. She knew who he was. She had always known. But knowing a man is a killer and seeing the fresh blood on his skin are two entirely different realities. Leo stared back at her. The violent high was crashing, replaced by a sudden, sharp spike of panic. He had let her see him. The one space in his life that felt clean was now contaminated by his reality. He waited for her to scream. He waited for her to run, to look at him with the same disgusted terror he saw in everyone else's eyes. Nora didn't scream. She let out a long, slow breath. The fear was there, a cold knot in her chest, but beneath it was a stubborn, cynical fatigue. She had grown up in neighborhoods where gunshots were lullabies. She had patched up her sister's black eyes when their father drank too much. Blood wasn't a shock. It was just a mess. Nora turned to the industrial sink. She cranked the hot water. She grabbed a bottle of heavy-duty dish soap and a clean white towel. She walked over to him. She didn't flinch away. "Put your hands out," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. Leo swallowed hard. He extended his hands. Nora poured the harsh blue soap directly onto his bloody knuckles. She took the wet towel and began to scrub. She wasn't gentle. She rubbed the fabric aggressively over his skin, working the soap into a thick pink lather as it lifted the blood. Leo watched her face. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. She was just cleaning him up, the same way she scrubbed a stubborn stain from the countertops. "You got it on your cuff," she muttered, pointing to the edge of his expensive shirt. "I don't think that's coming out. You'll have to throw the shirt away." Leo's chest hitched. A strange, breathless laugh escaped him. "It's custom. It's garbage now," she corrected, dragging the towel across his palm. She dragged him to the sink, pushing his hands under the scalding water to rinse the rest of the soap away. When they were clean, she tossed the ruined, bloody towel into the trash can. "Don't look at me like that," Leo rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Nora turned to face him. "Like what?" "Like I'm just another mess you have to clean." She crossed her arms over her chest, the flour on her hands, leaving white streaks across her black t-shirt. She looked at him, truly looked at him, at the exhaustion creeping back into his face, at the defensive posture of his shoulders. "You are a mess, boss," she said bluntly. "I just don't get paid enough to ask why." She turned her back to him and went back to the steel counter. She plunged her hands back into the dough, punching, folding, turning. Leo didn't leave. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, the adrenaline entirely drained from his system, replaced by an overwhelming, crushing gravity. He walked over to the counter, leaning his hip against the steel, standing just a foot away from her. He didn't say anything. He just watched her hands work the dough. And for the first time in his life, Leo Costa felt completely, terrifyingly safe. It was 2 a.m. The bodies were gone. The living room rug had been rolled up and hauled away by a clean-up crew that moved like ghosts. Carmine had given Leo a brief, grim nod before taking the private elevator down to street level. The penthouse was silent again, save for the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass. Leo walked into the kitchen. He had showered, scrubbing the last phantom traces of iron and copper from his skin. He wore dark grey sweatpants and a simple black t-shirt. His wet hair was pushed back from his forehead. Nora was still there. The bread was in the oven, filling the room with a rich, yeasty warmth that aggressively fought off the coldness of the night. She was standing by the stove, stirring a small pot. "You should be asleep," Leo said, leaning against the island counter. Nora didn't look up. "Couldn't sleep. The adrenaline makes my joints ache. Plus, I was hungry." "What are you making?" "Macaroni and cheese, the real kind, not the powdered garbage." She dumped a handful of shredded sharp cheddar into a thick bechamel sauce, watching it melt into a glossy, pale yellow cream. She tossed in cooked pasta, folding it together until it made a heavy, wet sound. She grabbed 2 deep ceramic bowls. She didn't ask if he wanted any. She just knew. She filled them both, sliding one across the counter to him, along with a heavy silver fork. Leo sat on a bar stool. Nora sat on the stool next to him. There was no formality, no distance, just 2 exhausted people eating in the middle of the night. Leo took a bite. It was scalding hot, incredibly rich, and coated his mouth with salt and fat. It tasted like comfort. It tasted like an apology for the violence he had brought into her space. He ate half the bowl in silence. Then he set his fork down. He turned his head to look at her. Nora was eating slowly. Her eyes were half closed, tired and heavy. She hadn't bothered to wipe the flour off her cheek. "Why didn't you run?" Leo asked quietly. Nora swallowed her bite of pasta. She didn't look at him immediately. She stared at the stainless steel hood of the stove. "Where would I run?" she asked, her voice dry. "I have a sister whose insulin costs $700 a month. I have a landlord who threatens eviction if I'm 2 days late on rent. The world out there is just as brutal as your world in here, Leo. The only difference is you wear a suit while you bleed people dry. The people I deal with wear uniforms and name tags." It was the first time she had used his first name. It hit him like a physical blow. "Leo. Not boss, not sir. I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The words tumbled out, entirely uncalculated, a desperate need for her to understand. "I would never let anything in that room touch you." Nora finally turned her head. Her dark eyes searched his face. She was deeply cynical. She knew men lied. She knew men with power lied best of all. But she looked at the vulnerability in his dark eyes, the way his broad shoulders hunched forward slightly, defensive and raw. "I know," she said simply. Leo let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He looked at her body. He couldn't help it. The proximity was doing something to his fractured nervous system. He looked at the thick, strong curve of her thigh, pressing against the denim of her jeans. He looked at the swell of her stomach beneath her apron, soft and yielding. He looked at her broad shoulders, capable of carrying the weight of her sister's life without breaking. He didn't just want her cooking anymore. The realization hit him with a heavy, primal thud. He wanted her. He wanted to bury his face in the crook of her neck. He wanted to feel the solid, undeniable weight of her body against his. He wanted to strip away the cynical armor she wore and find out what she sounded like when she wasn't fighting the world. He reached out. His hand crossed the space between them. He didn't touch her face. He touched the edge of the kitchen towel resting on the counter near her hand. His fingers brushed against her knuckles. Nora froze. Her breath hitched, a tiny, subtle sound in the quiet kitchen. She looked down at his hand. His skin was warm now. The long, elegant fingers of a man who commanded an empire, brushing against the rough, calloused skin of a woman who scrubbed floors. She didn't pull away. "You pay me to cook, Leo," she whispered. Her voice lacked its usual bite. It was a warning, but a weak one. "I know what I pay you for," Leo murmured, his voice dropping an octave, rich and gravelly. "I'm not asking for a transaction, Nora." He slowly moved his hand, sliding his fingers over hers. He felt the roughness of her palms. He turned her hand over, his thumb tracing the faint scars from old burns and knife slips. Nora's heart hammered violently against her ribs. She was used to being invisible, to being part of the furniture. Men like Leo Costa didn't look at women like her with hunger. They looked at her to order a drink or demand a clean towel. But the way he was looking at her now, it wasn't a glance. It was a devouring. "This is a bad idea," Nora breathed, staring at his thumb, moving slowly over her palm. "Probably," Leo agreed softly. He leaned in closer. The smell of his soap, cedar and something dark, mixed with the smell of the baking bread. He didn't kiss her. He just brought her flour-dusted hand up to his face. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, right where the skin was roughest. The touch sent a jolt of pure electricity up Nora's arm. She gasped, a soft, involuntary sound. Leo's dark eyes flicked up to meet hers, holding her gaze as he kissed her hand again. Slowly, reverently, like she was the only thing in his ruined, violent life that held any actual value. "I was starving before you," he whispered against her skin. "In every possible way." Nora couldn't speak. The cynical shield she had spent 27 years building cracked right down the middle. She was terrified. Not of the mob boss, not of the violence. She was terrified because, for the first time in her life, someone was looking at her heavy, exhausted, ordinary existence and treating it like salvation. The shift in the penthouse was not an explosion. It was a slow, agonizing change in atmospheric pressure. Nora did not run the morning after the blood in the kitchen. She showed up at 9 a.m., her hair pulled back into its usual tight, messy bun, carrying a plastic grocery bag of bruised peaches she bought from a street vendor. She walked into the kitchen, tied her faded black apron around her waist, and started peeling. Leo was already sitting at the dining table. He was reading a burner phone, a cup of black coffee cooling at his elbow. He wore a crisp navy suit, the tailoring impeccable, his shoulders broad and imposing. He looked like the man the tabloids feared. But when Nora turned on the gas burner, the sharp click, click, click of the ignition echoing in the quiet room, Leo looked up. Their eyes met. The memory of his mouth against her flour-dusted knuckles hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Nora's stomach gave a treacherous flutter, a traitorous spike of heat that she immediately tried to drown in cynicism. He was a billionaire mob boss. She was a woman who bought discount toilet paper in bulk. The math didn't work. It was a collision course, and she would be the one flattened on impact. She broke the gaze first, staring down at the cast-iron skillet. She made him a thick cut of sourdough toast, smothered in butter and a heavy spiced peach compote that smelled of cinnamon and brown sugar. She set it down in front of him. "I need to leave at 3 today," Nora said, keeping her voice strictly professional. "Maya's insulin needs to be picked up from the pharmacy in Southie, and I have to drop it at her apartment." Leo picked up his fork. "Carmine will drive you." Nora frowned. "I don't need a babysitter. I take the subway. It's faster." "You don't take the subway anymore," Leo said. His tone brooked zero argument. He cut into the toast, the crunch loud in the quiet room. He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Russo's crew is fractured. The head is gone, but the nerves are still twitching. His brother Tommy is asking questions. You don't walk around the city unprotected, not anymore." Nora crossed her arms. "Nobody knows who I am. I'm the maid. You're the woman who keeps me alive," Leo corrected bluntly. He chewed, swallowed, and set the fork down. "In my world, that makes you the most valuable asset I possess. Carmine drives you. That is non-negotiable. Nora's jaw tightened. She hated it. She hated the loss of control, the sudden intrusion of his violent reality into her mundane routine. But she also saw the rigid tension in Leo's jaw, the subtle way his hand hovered near the inside breast pocket of his jacket, where she knew he kept a matte black sidearm. "Fine," she snapped, "but tell him not to smoke in the car. It gives me a headache." Leo nodded once. Done. For the next 3 days, the tensions simmered. It was a physical thing, a static charge in the air whenever they were in the same room. Leo respected her space. He didn't touch her again. He didn't cross the invisible line they had drawn in the kitchen. But he watched her. He watched her wipe down the counters, his eyes tracking the heavy, capable shift of her hips. He watched her taste a bubbling pot of chili, blowing on the wooden spoon, her lips shiny with beef fat and spice. He was starving for her, a different kind of hunger that gnawed at his ribs. But he forced it down. He would not take. He would wait until she offered. Nora felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure. It made her clumsy. She dropped a measuring cup. She burned a batch of biscuits. The cynical armor she wore was cracking, replaced by a terrifying, vulnerable warmth. He didn't look at her like a fetish. He didn't look at her like a passing amusement. He looked at her like she was the center of gravity. On Thursday afternoon, the bubble burst. Nora was in the back seat of a black armored SUV. Carmine was driving. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the gritty streets of Southie into a slick, grey blur. The neighborhood was entirely different from Leo's downtown skyline. Here, the buildings were brick and tired. The neon signs flickered, buzzing with electrical faults. "Pull over by the corner," Nora told Carmine, pointing to a dilapidated pharmacy with a barred window. "I'll be 2 minutes." Carmine parked the heavy vehicle, the engine idling with a low, menacing rumble. "I'm coming in with you." "It's a pharmacy, Carmine, not a cartel drop," Nora sighed, grabbing her heavy canvas tote bag. "I need to talk to the pharmacist about Maya's dosage. I don't need a mobster standing behind me scaring the old lady behind the counter. Stay in the car. Watch the doors if it makes you feel better." Carmine scowled but unlocked the doors. 2 minutes, Nora, or I'm coming in." Nora stepped out into the biting rain. She pulled the collar of her cheap denim jacket up against the wind, jogging the 20 yards to the pharmacy entrance. The bell above the door jingled a flat, sad note as she walked in. The air smelled of old paper, rubbing alcohol, and cheap lavender soap. She walked to the back counter. Mrs. Higgins, a woman who looked like she was constructed entirely of wrinkles and grey wool, handed over the insulated paper bag holding the insulin vials. "Tell Maya I said hello, dear," Mrs. Higgins rasped. "I will. Thanks." Nora shoved the bag deep into her tote, making sure it was secure against her wallet. She turned to leave. She didn't make it to the door. 3 men stepped into the aisle, blocking her path to the exit. They weren't wearing suits. They wore heavy leather jackets and dark denim, their clothes damp from the rain. They looked rough, jagged, and heavily armed. The man in the center had a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. Tommy Russo. The bell above the door hadn't jingled. They had come in through the loading dock in the back. Nora stopped. The cynical fatigue in her chest vanished, instantly replaced by a cold, sharp rush of adrenaline. The air in the cramped aisle felt suffocatingly tight. "You're the cook," Tommy said. His voice was a rasping sneer. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her broad shoulders and thick waist with naked contempt. Costa must be losing his mind. I pictured someone thinner. Nora didn't speak. She tightened her grip on the heavy canvas straps of her tote bag. Her mind calculated the distance to the door. 10 feet, 3 men. "We're going to take a walk out the back door," Tommy instructed, reaching a hand into his jacket. The universal sign for a drawn weapon. "You're going to tell us what Leo's schedule looks like, where he sleeps, who's on the door." "I make meatloaf," Nora said, her voice flat, betraying none of the panic vibrating in her chest. "I don't know his schedule." "You sleep in the penthouse, you know." Tommy took a step forward. He reached out to grab her arm. He made 2 mistakes. First, he assumed she would freeze. Second, he severely underestimated her weight and leverage. Nora didn't shrink back. As Tommy's hand closed around her bicep, she violently twisted her body, using her low center of gravity. She swung the heavy canvas tote bag in a brutal arc. Inside the bag was a 2-pound steel thermos of hot coffee she had packed for herself. The bag connected directly with the side of Tommy's head. There was a sickening crunch. Tommy stumbled hard into a display of cough syrup, taking the metal shelving down with a deafening crash. Glass shattered. Red liquid bled across the linoleum. The 2 other men froze in shock for a split second. A maid was not supposed to fight back. Nora didn't hesitate. She didn't scream for Carmine. She drove the heel of her heavy work boot directly into the kneecap of the man on her left. He screamed, his leg buckling inward. As he dropped, she grabbed a heavy glass bottle of generic mouthwash from an intact shelf and smashed it directly into the face of the 3rd man. It wasn't elegant. It was messy, desperate, street-level violence. It was the survival instinct of a woman who had fought off muggers for grocery money her entire adult life. Tommy was groggily trying to push himself up from the ruined cough syrup display, his hand scrabbling for the gun in his jacket. Nora stepped forward, slamming her boot down onto his wrist. She ground her heel into the bone. Tommy roared in pain. Suddenly, the front windows of the pharmacy exploded inward. Glass rained down like shrapnel. Carmine burst through the front door, his weapon drawn, his face a mask of pure professional fury. But he didn't need to fire. The 2 standing men were already backing away, clutching their bleeding faces and broken knees. Tommy was trapped under Nora's boot. Carmine stopped. He lowered his weapon slightly, staring at the carnage in the narrow aisle. Nora was breathing heavily. Her bun had come undone, her dark hair hanging in damp, chaotic strands around her face. Her denim jacket was torn at the shoulder. She looked down at Tommy, her eyes completely dead. "Tell your boss," Nora gasped out, her chest heaving. "I only cook, I don't leak." She stepped off his wrist. She adjusted her tote bag, stepping over the shattered glass and pools of red syrup. She walked right past Carmine, pushing through the ruined front doors and stepping back out into the freezing rain. 2 more black SUVs were screeching to a halt by the curb. The back door of the lead vehicle flew open before it even fully stopped. Leo stepped out into the downpour. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't care about the rain ruining his suit. He looked frantic, a terrifying, unhinged energy radiating from his frame. He had gotten Carmine's distress signal. He expected to find her dead. Nora walked toward him. She was limping slightly, the adrenaline starting to crash, leaving behind a dull ache in her shin. Leo stopped on the pavement. He looked at the blood on her knuckles. Not his this time, but someone else's. He looked at her torn jacket. He looked at the fierce, stubborn tilt of her chin. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't treat her like glass. He crossed the remaining distance in 2 massive strides. He grabbed the lapels of her ruined denim jacket and pulled her flush against his chest. He buried his face in her wet hair. He breathed her in, his massive chest heaving against hers. I broke his nose, Nora mumbled into his expensive suit jacket. Her voice was shaking now. The fear was finally catching up. I'll break the rest of him, Leo promised, his voice a dark, jagged whisper against her ear. He wrapped a heavy arm around her waist, practically lifting her off the wet pavement, and pulled her into the safety of the armoured car. The penthouse was entirely silent. Leo had dismissed the staff. He had dismissed Carmine. He had locked the heavy oak doors and activated the perimeter security. Nora sat on the edge of the massive king-sized bed in Leo's master suite. The room was dark, lit only by the ambient glow of the city lights bleeding through the rain-streaked glass. She had showered, scrubbing the smell of copper, cheap mouthwash, and rain from her skin. She wore one of Leo's oversized black t-shirts. It fell to her mid-thigh, doing nothing to hide the thick, solid curve of her hips. Leo emerged from the master bathroom holding a first aid kit. He wore dark sweatpants, his chest bare. The scars from his violent life were stark against his skin. A knife wound on his ribs, a puckered bullet graze on his shoulder. He sat down on the edge of the bed next to her. The mattress dipped under his heavy frame. He didn't speak. He gently took her right hand, resting it on his knee. Her knuckles were bruised purple and split, the skin raw from connecting with Tommy's jaw. Leo opened a small bottle of antiseptic. He applied it to a cotton swab. "This is going to sting," he murmured. "I've had worse," Nora said, staring at the wall. Leo began to clean the cuts. His touch was agonizingly gentle. It was the exact inverse of the night she had scrubbed his hands in the kitchen sink. The roles were reversed, the balance perfectly, undeniably struck. He finished bandaging her knuckles. He didn't let go of her hand. He looked up at her. The air in the room grew instantly heavy, thick with the unspoken reality of what had happened. She hadn't just survived his world, she had fought back. She had proven with brutal clarity that she didn't need a savior. "You didn't have to fight," Leo said softly. "Carmine was 10 seconds away." "I don't wait to be rescued, Leo," Nora said, finally looking at him. Her dark eyes were exhausted but clear. "Nobody rescues the maid. You save yourself or you go under. You're not the maid." Leo moved. He slid his hand from her knuckles up her forearm, his thumb tracing the inside of her wrist, finding the rapid, thrumming pulse there. He shifted closer, his body heat radiating against her side. Nora's breath caught. The cynical armor was completely gone. She was stripped bare, sitting in a billionaire's bed wearing his clothes, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Leo," she whispered, a warning that lacked any heat. "You told me once that the world out there is brutal," Leo murmured, his hand sliding up to cup her jaw. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, wiping away a stray drop of water from her wet hair. "You were right, but in here, in this room, there is no brutality for you. There is only this." He leaned in. He didn't rush. He gave her every opportunity to pull away, to rebuild the wall. Nora didn't pull back. She leaned forward, closing the final inch between them. When his mouth met hers, there was no hesitation. It wasn't tentative. It was a collision of deep, starving gravity. Leo kissed her like a dying man taking his first breath of oxygen. His lips were firm, demanding, parting hers with a desperate heat. Nora gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his bare shoulders. His skin was blazing hot over heavy, corded muscle. Leo groaned, a low, guttural sound in the back of his throat. He shifted his weight, pressing her backward until she was lying flat against the dark silk sheets. He followed her down, hovering over her, his large frame caging her in. He kissed her jaw, her neck, the sensitive skin just below her ear. He breathed in the scent of her cheap vanilla soap, letting it ground him. Nora's hands slid down his back, her nails lightly scoring the skin between his shoulder blades. She felt the heavy, undeniable reality of his desire. He wasn't humoring her. He was obsessed with her. He pulled back just slightly, resting his forehead against hers. Both of them were breathing heavily. "I'm not built like the women you know," Nora whispered, a sudden sharp spike of insecurity piercing the haze of adrenaline. She hated herself for saying it, but the reality of her thick thighs, her stretch marks, her heavy stomach felt glaring under his gaze. Leo pulled entirely back, resting his weight on one forearm. He looked down at her. His eyes were dark, fierce, and completely unyielding. "The women I know are ghosts," Leo said, his voice a rough gravel. "They're empty. They don't eat. They don't fight. They just exist to be looked at." He moved his free hand, sliding it under the hem of her oversized t-shirt. His large, warm palm flattened against the soft, heavy curve of her stomach. The contrast was stark, his scarred, dangerous hand against her pale, yielding skin. Nora shivered. "You are solid," Leo murmured, his hand sliding upward to cup the heavy weight of her breast through the cotton, his thumb brushing the peak. "You are real. You are the only thing in my life that holds any actual weight." He leaned down and kissed her again, burying the rest of her insecurities in a wave of overwhelming, possessive heat. He worshipped her body. He worshipped the thick curve of her hips, the softness of her belly, the broad strength of her back. He took his time, a man who had starved for months, finally seated at a banquet, savoring every sound she made, every sigh, every arch of her back. Nora surrendered to it entirely. For the first time in 27 years, she didn't have to carry the weight. He was strong enough to carry it for her. 2 months later. The back room of the dockside warehouse was loud. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the clatter of silverware. The capos, the lieutenants, the men who ran the veins of the city's underworld, sat around the long mahogany table. Leo Costa sat at the head of the table. He wore a charcoal suit, the fabric stretched tight across a body that radiated raw, intimidating power. He was drinking a glass of vintage Barolo. He wasn't afraid of the wine. The heavy doors at the back of the room opened. The men instantly fell silent. The respect was immediate and absolute. Nora walked into the room. She wasn't wearing an apron. She wore a tailored black dress that hugged every thick curve of her body, completely unapologetic. Her hair was down, falling in dark waves over her shoulders. She wore no delicate jewelry, just a heavy, expensive watch on her wrist that matched Leo's. Behind her, 2 men carried massive silver trays. "Put it down," Nora directed, her voice carrying the natural authority of a woman who was entirely unimpressed by mobsters. The men set the trays down in the center of the table. No cloches, no foam. It was a mountain of baked ziti, heavy with ricotta and bubbling mozzarella. Beside it were massive platters of slow-roasted short ribs, falling off the bone, swimming in a dark, rich gravy. The smell of garlic, fat, and comfort hit the room like a physical force. Nora didn't serve anyone. She walked to the opposite end of the table. A chair had been pulled out for her. She sat down directly across from Leo. The men didn't touch the food. They waited. They looked to the head of the table. Leo picked up a heavy serving spoon. He scooped a massive portion of the short ribs onto his own plate. He took a bite, chewed, and swallowed. He looked down the length of the table. He looked at Nora. Her cynical mask was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded confidence. She wasn't the maid. She wasn't a liability. She was the anchor that kept the entire empire from floating away into paranoia and ruin. Leo raised his glass of wine, his dark eyes locking onto hers. A silent, fiercely protective promise. Nora raised her water glass in return, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. The king was no longer starving, and the queen had claimed her kitchen. Did Nora's fierce independence and Leo's intense transformation keep you hooked? This isn't your typical Mafia romance. It's a story about survival, grit, and finding power in the most unexpected places. If you loved watching Nora bring a billionaire boss to his knees with nothing but a cast-iron skillet and unapologetic confidence, hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who loves a fiercely relatable heroine who fights back. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more grounded, high-stakes romance stories. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment? The kitchen cleanup or the pharmacy brawl? Let us know.